All right, continuing on with structure and function of the human brain. Let's look at the tunics or the coverings of the brain, known as meninges. Just like the spinal cord, they are named very similarly. Dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So very similar to the spinal cord, but there are a few differences. The dura mater has two layers, the perosteal layer and the meningeal layer. The perosteal layer is against the bone, and there is a space in between the two layers. That's called the subdural space. The arachnoid is very similar in that there is an arachnoid network of fibers below the arachnoid mater between arachnoid and pia mater. So the subdural space is here. The arachnoid has a space below called the subarachnoid space. So arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space. The space, the subdural spaces between the layers of the dura mater are to drain blood from the brain. And the periosteal, or pardon me, the meningeal layer infolds to form some structures that add support to the brain, the fossa cerebri, for example. Let me write some notes about dura mater. Dura mater. Dura mater, the outermost tough membrane. Another difference between the brain and the spinal cord is there is no epidural space. So there is no epidural space in the brain. So this outermost tough membrane protects the brain from friction against the skull in part. So the outermost periosteal layer is against bone, protects friction. But where it is separated from the layer below, the meningeal layer, it forms sinuses. They're called dural venous sinuses. Draining blood from the brain. They also form the infoldings of the meningeal layer, also form supportive structures. And they are known as the fossa cerebri the fossa cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. There is no epidural space in the brain. There are also no pain receptors in the brain. The arachnoid mater forms a subarachnoid, sub meaning below, network of fibers through which cerebrospinal fluid flows. And the pia mater is very thin. Did you notice in the brain how thin it is? It holds the folds together. The gyri. The meninges of the brain. There is a disease in early childhood called meningitis. Meningitis, which is inflammation of the meninges. It occurs between about 3 months to 2 years of age. And there is a way that bacteria and viruses at this early age can enter the brain through the nose and throat. So it is bacterial or viral invasion through the nose and throat. So that can result in a fever, a stiff neck, drowsiness, intense headaches, for example, may progress to a coma if not treated. So it's diagnosed by checking the cerebrospinal fluid for white blood cells, and then antibiotics may be administered. So we did mention before that this is withdrawing cerebrospinal fluid to check it for white blood cells, spinal tap. So withdrawing cerebrospinal fluid to check for abundance of white blood cells. So this is a dissected brain, a sagittal view. The corpus callosum is this structure here. And that is the structure mentioned earlier that connects the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum. The other structures, that's number one, the other structures are ventricles. Ventricles are the spaces in which cerebrospinal fluid is produced and circulated. So there are the lateral ventricles. There's two of those, two lateral ventricles, one third ventricle, one cerebral aqueduct. That is the cerebral aqueduct. And number 5 is the fourth ventricle. Those are the ventricles of the brain.
Can you go back for a second on our slides? None of that stuff's showing up. I'm trying to label it.
It's red. Yeah, difficult to read. So number 1 is the corpus callosum. Number 2, those are lateral ventricles. I have a better slide coming up as well. But number 3 is the third ventricle. Number 4, the cerebral aqueduct. And number 5 is the fourth ventricle. So perhaps I'll show that before I write notes. Excuse me. So this is a better diagram to show you where the ventricles are. And I'll talk about the choroid plexus in a moment. That is a plexus of blood vessels that helps to produce cerebrospinal fluid. So let me make some notes about the ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. Or CSF. So the ventricles are lined with a specific kind of glial cell. It starts with an E, if you can remember. Does anyone remember? It starts with an E. Ependymal. We talked about that way back in nervous tissue, so chapter 12, with ependymal cells. And the ventricles contain a choroid plexus. Choroid plexus networks of capillaries that produce cerebrospinal fluid that further goes on to the ependymal cells, which adds some of the fluid. So subsequently, ependymal cells produce about 30%. So it's a clear liquid. It circulates throughout the brain and the spinal cord. So throughout the brain, it circulates between the ventricles, the aqueduct, and arachnoid space. And the spine central canal. So it is continuous with the spine. So what could the functions be of cerebrospinal fluid? Basically, your brain is suspended in this fluid as if it's floating. In a sense, it is actually floating. So it floats the brain so that it is neutrally buoyant. If it weren't for that, the pressure of the weight of the brain would crush it. Otherwise, the brain would weigh, well, 3 to 5 pounds, but in grams, about 1,500 grams. And would be weighed down and crushed. Instead, the realized weight of the brain when it's buoyant is just a mere 50 grams. So it doesn't crush the tissue, crush the brain tissue. So if you had a blow to the head, your brain is not solid. Instead, it's protected. It's protected from hitting the inside of the skull. So it cushions the brain from hitting the skull. But, of course, severe jolts can damage the brain. So the cerebrospinal fluid also maintains the chemical balance of the brain. Have you ever heard of the blood-brain barrier? The blood-brain barrier? So, as you can imagine, the brain requires an awful lot of energy. So yeah, Jen wrote something there about high altitude, lower gravity. It takes the pressure off the brain. That's interesting. Yeah, so at lower altitudes, you're saying at lower altitudes. Oh, at high altitudes. Yeah, there's lower gravity at the high altitudes. There's lower atmospheric pressure. Yeah, at a high altitude. That's very true. And at high altitude, blood tends to be more oxygenated because of the lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. Yeah, good point. Very good point. So why is this blood-brain barrier required? The blood-brain barrier. It's this extra protection that the brain gets. Extra protection. Because the brain requires extra protection because although it is only about 2% of your body weight, it requires an enormous amount of oxygen and glucose. Let's see, 15% of blood and 20% of the body's requirement of oxygen and glucose. We said before that neurons are extremely metabolically demanding. A 10-second loss of oxygen and glucose to the brain would lead to unconsciousness. In 1 to 2 minutes, impaired neural function. And 4 minutes could lead to irreversible damage. So what is the blood-brain barrier? The blood-brain barrier is endothelial cells with tight junctions between them. That hold the cells closely together, and the astrocytes help to not to form, but to keep those junctions tight junctions. So with the help of astrocytes. If you recall, astrocytes extend their plasma membrane. They have those little feet, and they keep the cells close together. So that forms a barrier between blood and the parenchyma of the brain. So immune cells, therefore, neutrophils and other white blood cells cannot penetrate that barrier. But the brain contains microglia, its own white blood cells. Microglia. So this blood-brain barrier also, importantly, prevents the penetration to the brain of possible blood-borne pathogens. Like bacteria or viruses. The plasma membrane of the endothelial cells is permeable to some things. So the endothelium, however, is permeable to small molecules, as most plasma membranes are. Small molecules like, for example, caffeine, alcohol, carbon dioxide, nicotine, and anesthetics. There are organs that require access to blood, however, because the brain is constantly monitoring the body, monitoring the body. The brain, so certain areas of the brain, particularly the hypothalamus or the thalamus, the hypothalamus, certain areas monitor blood for homeostasis in order to maintain the homeostasis of the body. So in this area, the brain monitors such things as glucose levels, temperature, pH, for example. Yeah, that's the ventricular system of the human brain, cerebrospinal fluid. Here's an example of the blood-brain barrier. So here are the little feet of the astrocyte here that you can see. A paracyte, not like the parasite that you think of, but a pericyte, which is a cell. It's a support cell. This is the endothelial cell here. And here is one of the tight junctions between the endothelial cells. So this is a layer of endothelial cells here. Tight junctions between the cells. This is the inside, the brain. Microglia, those are our immune cells in the brain. Astrocytes, maintaining those tight junctions, and it keeps our white blood cells and pathogens out of the brain tissue. So I'd like to stop there, if you don't mind.